something just surfaced that completely changes how people see Kody Brown and his relationship with Robyn Brown. And once you hear it, you cannot unsee it. So stay with me because this gets deeper fast. And if you want the real truth behind reality TV, hit subscribe right now because we break stories others will not. It began as a moment that looked like it might finally answer years of questions, a moment that seemed carefully framed to suggest growth, clarity, and a deeper understanding of what had gone wrong and what could still be repaired. But the longer you watch it, the more it feels like something else entirely, something that quietly pulls the viewer into a different direction, one that is less about resolution and more about revelation. Because as Kody Brown sits in front of the camera, speaking in a tone that feels measured and deliberate, there is an underlying tension that cannot be ignored. It is the kind of tension that does not come from what is being said, but from what is being hinted at, what is being left unsaid, and what seems to exist just beneath the surface of every word. He talks about needing to hold space for Robyn, as if it is a realization that has just arrived, as if it is something new, something transformative, something that changes everything that came before. And yet there is a subtle contradiction built into that statement, because the idea of holding space is not something that appears out of nowhere. It is something that grows over time, something that is shaped by consistency, by awareness, and by a willingness to meet another person where they are. And so the question begins to form almost immediately. If this is truly a new realization, then what does that say about everything that came before? And if it is not new, then why does it feel like it is being presented that way? And this is where the story begins to open up in a way that feels both compelling and unsettling at the same time. Because instead of offering a clear answer, it creates a loop, a pattern of thought that keeps circling back on itself, each time revealing a slightly different angle, a slightly different possibility. As he continues speaking, he reflects on the past, on how his relationships once operated, on how there was a certain level of flexibility, a certain level of acceptance that allowed things to function in a way that may have felt easier at the time, but now appears more complicated when viewed through a different lens. And while he does not directly frame it as a problem, there is an implication that something about that dynamic may not have been sustainable, that something about it may have created an imbalance that only became visible once it was no longer there. And this is where the narrative begins to shift from reflection to realization, because in describing what once worked, he is also revealing what may have been missing, and that contrast becomes impossible to ignore. It raises questions about expectations, about roles, and about the way in which those roles were maintained over time. Because when one person is given the space to move freely while others are expected to adjust, the balance becomes fragile, even if it appears stable on the surface. And as this idea starts to take shape, another layer is added to the story, one that moves the focus from the past to the present. Because if the old dynamic is no longer in place, then what has replaced it? What does the current structure look like, and how is it being maintained? And this is where the tone of the story becomes more intense, because there are subtle hints that the environment inside the home has changed in ways that are not immediately visible to them. Outside the world, there are suggestions of a quieter atmosphere, of a more controlled rhythm of interactions that are more deliberate and more carefully managed. And within that environment, there is a sense that every action, every word, every decision carries more weight than it once did. Because without the presence of multiple perspectives, without the distribution of emotional responsibility, the dynamic becomes more concentrated, more focused, and potentially more sensitive to disruption. And this is where the concept of holding space begins to take on a different meaning, because it is no longer just about being present, it becomes about maintaining balance, about ensuring that the system continues to function in a way that feels stable, even if that stability requires constant effort. And as this realization begins to settle in, another question emerges, one that adds a new layer of suspense to the narrative. What happens when that effort becomes too much? What happens when the person who is expected to maintain that balance begins to feel the strain of doing so? And this is where the story tightens, because it introduces the possibility of change, not as a distant outcome, but as something that could already be in motion, something that may be unfolding quietly behind the scenes, while the public narrative continues to present a different image. And this contrast between what is seen and what is experienced becomes one of the most compelling aspects of the story, because it creates a sense of uncertainty, a feeling that there is more to understand, more to uncover, and more to question. And just as the viewer begins to piece together one version of events, another detail appears, another perspective that shifts the interpretation and brings the story back to its central loop. Is this a genuine turning point, or is it a carefully constructed moment designed to suggest change without fully addressing the underlying issues? And this loop continues to draw the viewer in because it does not offer a clear resolution. It invites exploration, it encourages curiosity, and it keeps the focus on what might come next, rather than what has already been explained. And as the narrative continues to build, it becomes clear that this is not just about one conversation or one realization. It is about a pattern that has developed over time, a pattern that is now being examined from a new angle. And that examination reveals both the strengths and the weaknesses of the system that was in place. Because while it may have worked for a certain period, it may also have created conditions that were difficult to sustain in the long term. And this realization adds depth to the story. It transforms it from a simple moment of reflection into a broader exploration of how relationships evolve, how they adapt, and how they respond to changing circumstances. And within that exploration, there is a sense that the current moment is part of a larger process, one that is still unfolding, one that has not yet reached its conclusion. And that is what keeps the audience engaged, because there is a recognition that the story is not finished, that there are still pieces missing, that there are still questions waiting to be answered, and that the next development could shift the entire narrative in a way that changes how everything is understood. And so the focus returns once again to that original moment, to the words that were spoken, and to the meaning behind them. Because in a story like this, every detail matters, every nuance carries significance, and every interpretation adds another layer to the overall picture. And as those layers continue to build, the story becomes richer, more complex, and more difficult to define in simple terms. It becomes a reflection not just of one relationship, but of the broader dynamics that shape how people connect, how they communicate, and how they navigate the challenges that arise when expectations and realities begin to diverge. And within that reflection, there is an opportunity to see the situation from multiple perspectives, to consider not just what is being said, but why it is being said, and how it fits into the larger context of everything that has come before, and everything that may still be ahead. And this is where the true power of the narrative lies, not in providing definitive answers, but in creating a space for ongoing exploration, a space where the audience can engage with the story on a deeper level, and where each new insight contributes to a more complete understanding of what is really taking place behind the scenes. And as this understanding continues to evolve, the story remains open-ended, dynamic, and full of possibilities, inviting the viewer to stay engaged, to keep questioning, and to be ready for whatever comes next. As the narrative moves forward, the sense of tension does not fade. Instead, it deepens in a way that feels almost inevitable, as if every earlier moment was quietly leading to this point, where the surface-level explanations no longer feel sufficient, and where the need to understand what is really happening becomes impossible to ignore. Because what once appeared to be a stable situation now carries subtle signs of strain, signs that may not be obvious at first glance, but become clearer the longer you look and the more closely you listen. And it is within these details that the story truly begins to unfold, because they reveal a dynamic that is constantly adjusting, constantly responding to pressures that are both internal and external. And this constant adjustment creates an environment where nothing feels entirely settled, where even moments of calm seem to carry an undercurrent of uncertainty. And this is where the idea of balance becomes central to everything, because maintaining stability in such an environment requires effort, it requires awareness, and it requires a level of cooperation that may not always be easy to sustain. And as this realization takes hold, another layer of the story begins to emerge, one that focuses on how individuals within that space are navigating these challenges, how they are interpreting the changes around them, and how they are deciding what steps to take next. Because in situations like this, decisions are rarely simple. They are influenced by a combination of emotions, expectations, and practical considerations that all intersect in ways that can be difficult to untangle. And this complexity adds to the suspense, because it means that there is no single path forward, no obvious solution that resolves everything at once. Instead, there are multiple possibilities, each with its own set of outcomes, each leading in a slightly different direction. And as these possibilities begin to take shape, the narrative shifts from observation to anticipation, because the focus is no longer just on what has already happened, it is on what could happen next. And this shift creates a sense of momentum, a feeling that the story is moving towards something significant, even if that destination has not yet been fully defined. And within this momentum, there are hints that changes may already be underway, that conversations may be happening in private, that decisions may be forming quietly beneath the surface, and that the direction of the relationship may be evolving in ways that are not yet visible to the outside world. And this idea introduces a new level of intrigue, because it suggests that the most important developments may be occurring out of view, that what is being presented publicly is only one part of a much larger picture, and that understanding that picture requires looking beyond what is immediately apparent and considering the factors that may be influencing events behind the scenes. And as the audience begins to explore these possibilities, they are drawn deeper into the story, because each new insight adds another piece to the puzzle, while also raising new questions about how those pieces fit together and what they ultimately reveal. And this process of discovery becomes one of the most engaging aspects of the narrative, because it encourages active participation. It invites viewers to think critically, to analyze what they are seeing, and to consider multiple perspectives, rather than accepting a single interpretation. And as this engagement grows, the story becomes more immersive, more layered, and more compelling, because it reflects the complexity of real-life situations, where answers are rarely straightforward, and where understanding often requires patience and careful consideration. And just as it seems like a clearer picture might be forming, another element is introduced, one that adds further depth and reinforces the idea that the situation is still evolving, because there are indications that external factors may also be playing a role, that financial responsibilities, public expectations, and long-term planning may all be contributing to the decisions that are being made. And this broader context expands the scope of the story, because it shows that the dynamics within the relationship are not isolated. They are connected to a larger framework of responsibilities and pressures that influence how individuals respond to challenges and how they prioritize their actions. And this connection between the personal and the practical creates additional tension, because it means that choices are not made in a vacuum. They have consequences that extend beyond the immediate situation, and that must be carefully considered in order to maintain a sense of stability and direction. And as these considerations become more prominent, the narrative reaches a point where the balance between continuity and change becomes increasingly important, because there is a need to preserve what works while also addressing what does not. And finding that balance can be one of the most difficult aspects of any evolving situation. And this difficulty adds to the sense of suspense, because it highlights the possibility that adjustments may not always be enough, that at some point, a more significant shift may be required in order to move forward. And this possibility becomes a central question within the story because it represents a turning point, a moment where the direction of the narrative could change in a meaningful way, depending on the choices that are made and the actions that follow. And as the audience considers this turning point, they are once again drawn back to the beginning, to that original moment of reflection that seemed to promise clarity and resolution. Because in light of everything that has been revealed since then, that moment takes on a new meaning. It becomes less about a simple realization and more about a signal, an indication that something within the dynamic was already beginning to shift, even if the full extent of that shift was not yet visible. And this reinterpretation adds a layer of continuity to the story because it connects the past and the present in a way that shows how one moment can influence everything that follows, and how understanding that connection can provide valuable insight into what might come next. And as the narrative continues to unfold, this sense of connection remains at its core, guiding the exploration of new developments and shaping the way in which each new piece of information is understood and integrated into the larger picture. And this ongoing process ensures that the story remains dynamic, that it continues to evolve in response to new factors and new perspectives, and that it retains the ability to surprise, to challenge, and to engage the audience in a way that feels both meaningful and compelling. Because at its heart, this is a story about change, about the ways in which people adapt to shifting circumstances, and about the decisions that ultimately determine the direction of their journey. And as that journey continues, the only certainty is that there is more to come, more to discover, and more to understand. And that is what keeps the audience invested, because the story is not finished, it is still unfolding, and its final shape has yet to be revealed.